Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of History with Cy. In the last episode on Cyprus, I mentioned that according to an object known as the Esarhaddon prism, there were at least 10 kingdoms that occupied the island in ancient times. Dating to around 672 BCE, the Esarhaddon prism is a clay, hexagonal prism that gives accounts of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon's conquests and the lands that he either ruled directly over or exacted tribute from. It mentions a wide expanse of territory, from Elam in what is today Iran, the Anatolian highlands of southern Turkey, Babylonia in what's today Iraq, the Canaanite and Phoenician cities of the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and several other places. Included with these are 10 kingdoms on Cyprus that were subservient to him. How much control Esarhaddon had of Cyprus, which in those days was called Alasia, is debatable, because there's very little evidence on the island itself to indicate any real Assyrian presence there. However, the 10 kingdoms mentioned on the Esarhaddon prism were very real. Most of our information with regard to them comes from post-classical Greek sources, many of which contain more legend than fact. Though modern scholars actually believe that there may have been many more kingdoms and city-states on Cyprus, the ones that we're going to gloss over here are the 10 that Esarhaddon mentions, most of which were relatively well known between the late Bronze Age up until the Roman period. What's interesting is that several of the names of the kings on the prism are of both Greek and Phoenician origin, meaning that Cypriot society at the time had influences and elements of both cultures. So, let's take a look at these cities, one by one. On the southern coast of Cyprus was the kingdom of Amathus. The original city of Amathus, from which the kingdom sprung up, dates back at least to the year 1000 BCE. However, the most concrete evidence of an actual kingdom comes about 200 years later in 800 BCE, when evidence of a Phoenician city with a palace, as well as several cemeteries, surfaces in the archaeological record. The city traded heavily with other parts of the eastern Mediterranean world, most notably Greece and the city-states of the Levant. Like other parts of the island, Amathus was subject to the kings of Achaemenid Persia for most of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. For the most part, its rulers were quite loyal to them. In fact, when Onisilus, the king of Salamis, asked Amathus' king to join him in an island-wide revolt against the Persians, he refused. According to our source on the matter, which is none other than Herodotus' The Histories, Onisilus sought to punish the city of Amathus for its refusal to fight with him against their common Persian overlord. He writes the following: "The Persians had the advantage over the Cyprians, and after their army had been put to rout, many others fell, and among them Onisilus, he who brought about the revolt of the Cyprians. So the men of Amathus cut off the head of Onisilus, because he had besieged them. And having brought it to Amathus, they hung it over the gate of the city. As the head hung there, when it had now become hollow, a swarm of bees entered it, and filled it with honeycomb. This having so come to pass, the Amathusians consulted an oracle about the head, and they received an answer, bidding them to take it down and bury it, and sacrifice to Onisilus every year as a hero. And if they did this, it would go better with them." So, that's Herodotus' story. And being Herodotus, one has to take it with a large grain of salt. However, less than 2 centuries later, in 332 BCE, the kingdom of Amathus allied with Alexander the Great and supplied him with ships during his siege of the Persian-allied Phoenician city of Tyre. After Alexander's death, Amathus fell into the domain of his former general Ptolemy, who disbanded its rulers with those loyal to himself. It remained a prosperous city for the rest of antiquity until its abandonment in the 7th century after the Arab invasion of Cyprus. Soloi, also known as Soloi, derived a good portion of its wealth from the copper mines located to its south. According to Plutarch, the city was once called Apaea, but the name changed in the 6th century BCE when the Athenian statesman and sage, Solon, visited it and strongly advised its king, Philokypros to move or build a new capital city closer to the sea. Following the Athenian sage's advice, Philokypros put Solon in charge of the re-establishment of the city. Apparently, the new city became so prosperous that out of gratitude for Solon's advice, Philokypros renamed the city Soloi in his honor. Herodotus mentions that Philokypros' son, Aristokypros, joined other local rulers under Onesilos in the failed rebellion against Persian rule. After a 5-month siege, the city fell to the Persians. Kurion, also known as Curium in Latin, dates back to at least the 11th century BCE, if not earlier. The first written reference to it can be found on the Esarhaddon prism, where it's called Kuri and was said to have been ruled by a king named Damasu. Kurion originally joined King Onesilos of Salamis in 499 BCE in the island's revolt against the Persians. However, probably sensing that the tide had turned against them, its king, Stasanor, betrayed Onesilos and defected to the Persians, helping them to smash other rebellions and to consolidate their hold over the entire island. Kurion remained under Persian rule until its last known king, Pasicrates, joined Alexander the Great in the siege of Tyre in 332 BCE. After that, Kurion seems to have prospered up through Roman times until it was destroyed by an earthquake in the year 365. Located on the northwestern shores of Cyprus, the city known as Marion is believed by many scholars to have once been a Mycenaean colony. Historically, Marion was an extremely prosperous kingdom due to its proximity to local copper mines, as well as its trade with the Aegean. It was also one of the cities that was temporarily liberated from Persian rule by the famous Greek statesman and general Cimon during a failed rebellion in the year 449 BCE. Marion remained under Persian control until 332 BCE, when, like most of the other cities on the island, it too submitted to Alexander the Great. Its one great mistake, though, was supporting the wrong side in the Wars of the Diadochi, which were the conflicts between Alexander's generals and successors over the territories of his empire. Marion sided with Antigonus, who eventually lost Cyprus to Ptolemy. As punishment, Ptolemy destroyed the city in 312 BCE and had its remaining residents forcibly relocated to the city of Paphos. Around 270 BCE, his successor, Ptolemy II, built a new city on top of the ruins of Marion and gave it to his wife, Arsinoe, who also happened to be his sister. Also called Arsinoe, the city grew and prospered well into Roman times. Chitroi is one of Cyprus's oldest known cities and kingdoms, with archaeologists dating its founding to sometime during the late 2nd millennium BCE. The first time Chitroi appears in written documents is in the Esarhaddon prism, where it's called Kitrusi. Classical writers from the 4th and 5th centuries BCE also mention it, and like other Cypriot cities, it too was prosperous for much of the Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine periods. It was only abandoned after it was sacked by the Arabs in 912, which resulted in its mostly Greek population fleeing to other Byzantine-controlled territories. Legend has it that Kition, also known by its Latin name, Citium, was established shortly after the Trojan War. However, most archaeologists believe that this is just a myth, and that in reality, it was established by Phoenician traders from Tyre in the early 1st millennium BCE, who called it Kart Hadasht. Though they may have been its initial inhabitants, over time, the kingdom's Greek population grew significantly to rival that of the Phoenician, and culturally, Kition became a blend of the two. By the time of the Ionian Revolt in 499 BCE, Kition was ruled by Greek kings who supported the anti-Persian rebellion. However, when the rebellion was crushed, the Persians installed a Phoenician king that was loyal to them. This same line of Phoenician kings supplied the Persians with ships to help them control the eastern Mediterranean, including the Greek-speaking states of the Aegean. Thus, having been favored by the Persians, as well as having a good harbor, the city and kingdom prospered and became one of the wealthiest on Cyprus. Though eventually, Kition submitted to Alexander the Great, the Phoenician dynasty was allowed to keep its position as long as it remained loyal to the Macedonian king. However, when Ptolemy, one of Alexander's successors, conquered Cyprus from his rival Antigonus, the Phoenician dynasty was dissolved, and its last king, Pumayathon, was killed. The Romans took over Kition in 58 BCE, and the city did well until its destruction in the first half of the 300s by multiple earthquakes. Located in the hills of Cyprus's interior, Idalion's history stretches as far back as the Late Bronze Age. It seems to have had a rather unique political arrangement in that power was shared between a king and a special group of citizens, which at the time was quite rare. The Cypro-syllabic script was also deciphered based on a bilingual Phoenician Cypriot tablet that was found in Idalion. Idalion was also unique in that, unlike other kingdoms or city-states on Cyprus, by 500 BCE, it was already issuing its own coins. In 470 BCE, Idalion fell to a joint Persian-Phoenician force and ended up being ruled from Kition. Not being a port city, it's not really known how or if it aided Alexander in the siege of Tyre. Like other cities, it too was eventually taken over by Ptolemy, but by Roman times, the city seems to have faded into obscurity. It's said that when the Greek goddess Aphrodite first stepped ashore after her birth in the sea, she planted her foot in Paphos. Thus, it's easy to see how the city held a special place among worshippers of the goddess. However, on a more earthly level, Paphos was a mixture of Greek, Phoenician, and other cultural elements, and was once one of the largest, most cosmopolitan, and wealthiest of the 10 Cypriot kingdoms. It was also famous for its jewelry and craft industries, which manufactured all sorts of items made from ceramic, ivory, gold, and of course, copper. In the 4th century BCE, the city was renamed Palai Paphos, meaning Old Paphos, to distinguish it from the nearby harbor town of Nea Paphos, meaning New Paphos. Shortly after this, Old Paphos went into decline, with most of its residents moving to New Paphos. Unlike the other city-states of Cyprus, we don't really know much about the kingdom of Ledrai, also known as Ledra, other than the fact that it was located on or near the site of Cyprus's current capital of Nicosia. Most scholars believe that it was a relatively small farming kingdom, and being landlocked, had to rely on the neighboring kingdoms for all of its imports. It probably got absorbed by one of these kingdoms, so that by the time of Alexander the Great, it really ceased to exist as a political unit. Located in the copper-rich center of Cyprus, Amathus has an interesting story. It was apparently sold in the 4th century BCE for just 50 talents by its ruler to the Phoenician king Pumayathon of Kition. However, shortly after that, it was taken from Pumayathon by Alexander the Great and given to Salamis' king, Pinitagoras, probably as a reward for aiding him in the siege of Tyre. It may have also been because Alexander wanted a reliable ally to help oversee the copper mines that were in close proximity to Amathus. In terms of archaeological highlights, Amathus is famous for 2 well-preserved royal tombs, as well as a temple dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite. And finally, we come to the city and kingdom of Salamis. This is a different Salamis than the island near Athens of the same name. It eventually went on to become the most powerful kingdom of ancient Cyprus. One of its early rulers, King Euelthon, is said to have held sway over the entire island. In 499 BCE, his famous grandson, Onisilus, united all of the major Cypriot kingdoms and cities against the Persians, save for Amathus. This ultimately cost him his life, but as mentioned in Herodotus' story, he became a hero and his memory has lived on. Another very famous king of Salamis was Evagoras I, who became its ruler in 411 BCE and used his position to promote Greek culture throughout the island. Of all of Cyprus's kingdoms, Salamis was the staunchest supporter of Alexander in his siege of Tyre, and as a result, was rewarded handsomely by the Macedonian conqueror. Not only this, but Salamis's king, Nicocreon, sided with Ptolemy against Antigonus for control of Cyprus after Alexander's death. When Ptolemy won the conflict, all of Cyprus's other kingdoms were dismantled and their rulers deposed, with the exception of Salamis. Nicocreon was not only able to keep his throne, but also given other kingdoms to rule over as a reward for his loyalty. In 306 BCE, the area just off the coast of Salamis was the site of a fierce naval battle between Ptolemy and Demetrius I of Macedon. Demetrius's victory here resulted in his eventual takeover of the entire island, though Ptolemy won it back in 295 BCE. So that's just a little bit of history of the kingdoms of Cyprus. I hope that you enjoyed this program, and of course, I'll have many more on the history of the Mediterranean and the ancient world coming up very soon. Thanks so much for stopping by, I really appreciate it. If you learned something, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Can't wait to catch you in the next episode. Take care.